This is the Change Physician, episode 150.
Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Change Physician podcast. As your host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, with my Amazeballs co-host, Dr. Melissa Katie. And today, because we're in the middle of the Thanksgiving holidays, we figured we would actually pull up some of our old guests from last year and had a couple of interviews that we wanted to kind of specifically highlight. So this particular episode for 150 is actually a replay of episode 8, very early in the Change Physician journey here, with one of our guests that we've had him back multiple times, always a great thinker, always appreciate his insights, and that's Dr. Tait. This particular episode was originally recorded after the incidents surrounding George Floyd, which led to a lot of civil unrest and a very difficult summer, to say the least. And with some of the events in the last week, 2 weeks, as we published this in late November of 2021, I think it's important to play this again. It is very easy to assume we know, and we do a lot of thinking episodes when it comes to the Change Physician podcast, a lot of focus on awareness. And a lot of focus, I would hope, and maybe we need to do some episodes specifically about this, about the nature of bias. We each have very, very different experiences. Being able to step back and notice that who we are has been influenced by the environments that we're in is really, really key. And so we're going to play Dr. Tait's episode again. And I think there's a lot of information here for people to take away. This is not a simple thing of they're right, they're wrong. This is BLM versus whatever, and throw up your hands, Antifa's bad. It's really understanding that each of us have different lived experience, being able to step back and be able to really understand that things that have not happened to you personally doesn't mean they are not happening to other people. So important episode, and I can't think of a better one to replay right now. So
enjoy episode.
Welcome back to the Change Physician podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Katie, joined by my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, and have our wonderful guest today, Dr. Tait. First of all, Dr. Tait, thank you for coming back on the podcast. You're always a pleasure to speak with.
No, thank you for having me back on, guys. I really love having conversations with you all. They're very enlightening.
Awesome. Well, I want to start from the top, really with a conversation about what it's like to be a Black man or a man of color in America. But I want to hear from you. Like, sometimes I feel this hesitation on the words to use, whether it's, I should say, Black or a man of color, because, not everyone's African American. There's all different shades. We're all spectrums, and it's all based on our melanin production and our melanocytes, for those that don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so one, I'm going to preface by saying I do not speak for all Black people or the Black nation of the United States, or for African Americans or all people of color. This is my own ranting and my own musings. Some people agree with me, some people don't. And so the biggest thing to understand is that the descendants of the enslaved in this country are not a monolith. We all think differently. I tend to actually be libertarian in my thinking, and especially in my when it comes to money and investing. So understand that. So this is just the talkings of one guy, right? But I do think about these kinds of things. And so we were joking off air before. I always say that Black folks trust white people who call us Black. White people who call us African American in a kind of sanitized way, I pretty much know that you probably don't have any Black friends. And I say that because kind of Blackness in the United States is for people who are the descendants of the enslaved, for people who may have come over who have African descent. So you can have an immigrant who comes over and considers themselves Black, and they didn't have any enslaved parents. Like Barack Obama doesn't have any ancestral lineage of being enslaved, but he's a Black man in the United States because of cultural affinity. He has decided that he married Michelle from a cultural affinity standpoint. He said, I am Black, right? He doesn't call himself African American. He's a Black guy, right? And so that alone shows a familiarity with who we are and what we are. And so using those terms, just understand that Black folks in this country inhabit what W.E.B. Du Bois called dual consciousness. We understand our culture, but we also have to understand the dominant white culture as well. So we know you all but you in many ways don't necessarily know us, right? And we talk about that in closed doors, right? We'll make this a very candid conversation, right? And so from that standpoint, when white people say, hey, you know, the Black community, this, we know that there's an affinity somehow. Somehow you've been curious enough to understand who we are as a group, and it's an easy way to create an easy dialogue with people back and forth. And so just from a what to call, what to use, you know, if you're on CNN, yeah, you can say African American, right? But if you're talking casually amongst people, you know, the Black community, if you use Black, it creates a much more, I would say, at ease conversation, just for your own edification.
Yeah, I guess for being such a literal person, there's times where I feel like, well, I guess for me, I think of this idea of color, that the fact that we've created categories that psychologically, regardless of which race you're in or how you want to describe yourself, which culture, whatever it is, there's this part of me that wants to like just rip that all apart and just not have such a visual connotation or category for human beings. Like there's this part of me that doesn't, like if I had to pick you out in a crowd, like first of all, I know that you're Black or a man of more color than I am, you know, but once I get to know you, it's not at the forefront of my mind. I see you as Dr. Eric Tait. But if someone asks me to point you out in a crowd and you're darker than somebody else, yeah, I'm going to say that. Like, I don't ever forget that you are, but I think that's the reality of how we, sometimes we overemphasize the visual and we underemphasize the less visual thing. Like think of the pandemic or the virus. People they don't believe it as much because they can't see it. But the moment they see something, put too much emphasis or give it too much importance when that's not really the most important thing. Now there are gray areas too. There are things that, you know, visual is important.
And I would say, don't get wrapped around that axle, right? It's an easy shorthand, and it's not, the issue is when stereotypes are conferred along the visual, not that the visual exists, right? It's when the visual is assumed to be the group. So you'll see on the news a bunch of Black folks doing crime potentially, and assume that that's the whole group, right? And so it's the intention matters, right? Description is description, right? Oh, the Black guy over there, the white girl over there, the white girl with blonde hair, the Black girl with blonde hair, right? Those are easy. Don't get wrapped around the axle with that kind of stuff. And it's interesting because more liberal and progressive folks get wrapped around those kind of things. We don't, as Black folks, we don't care about that kind of stuff, right? What we care about is the connotations and intent around it, right? Mm-hmm. Descriptions are what they are. They're shorthand. As long as it doesn't spill over into stereotypes and assumptions, that's where it gets what we call the deaths by 1,000 cuts, those microaggressions, those little things that grade on us like, oh, again, oh, you want to touch my hair again? Oh, you say I'm articulate, you say I'm this. If you wouldn't say it for other people who are white or Asian, don't say it for Black folks, right? Or don't do it to Black folks, right? That's where things can get a little dicey. But just from a descriptive standpoint, with no intent around it, don't get wrapped around the axle. We're not that sensitive for the most part. Again, for at least my friends that I talk about. Maybe there are some people who are, but for the most part, we're not. From that standpoint,
I think that's an important point, and particularly since we're sort of entering this discussion here, is just having an awareness. If you would not say that, or whatever you're going to say, to someone else of whatever your ethnic background would be, then at a minimum you should be thinking of your words in a much more cautious manner, right? And this just comes to, you know, like what you said, it just kind of hit me when you're saying, oh, you're really articulate. What the hell does that even mean?
It's a compliment, but as long as you make that compliment to multiple people, we're fine.
Exactly. And so I just think that's a good takeaway. And if people just have a little bit of a moments where they just take an awareness of their words and just start thinking, I guess this goes back to the golden rule kind of a thing, is just treat other people like you would want to be treated yourself. And so use the same words and descriptions around other people that you would want for yourself or your friends and family.
And I actually have a little switch around that. I don't use the golden rule because it centers you in the process. And that is really what we're talking about. If you really look at kind of this larger thing, it's what racism and all of this is about is who is centered, who is the norm, right? The golden rule of do unto others as you'd want them to do unto you. No, do unto others as they want to be done unto, which requires you to then ask them, well, how do you want to be treated? How do you want to experience this process? Because you and I may be very different in terms of how we want to experience something. And so what works for you may not get me to where I need to be. I may need more, I may need less. And so I always say is, do unto others as they want to be done unto. So ask them, how do you want to be treated? How do you want to be referred to? And it's not necessarily patronizing, right? It is really, in some ways, endearing, right? That someone will think enough to decenter themselves and say, okay, well, I'm not the center of this universe. There are other people that I am experiencing this space with. What do they want? What do they need? What are they lacking? Because you may not be lacking anything. So you can treat somebody just as a difference between kind of, equity and equality, right? Equity is very different than equality.
Eric, can I label that now as the platinum rule? Because that is such a step above the golden rule, and anybody and everybody can use it. And particularly, again, from a physician's standpoint, we should be doing that with our patients, right? Anyway, so that's freaking brilliant. Do unto others as they would want to have done to them. Or did I label? Yeah, I love it. Love it.
That makes me think of, in general, this idea of focus on the person in pain or in need or is needing something else beyond what you think you need for yourself, that kind of thing. When I think of the Black Lives Matter, I love it. And I tell people, I did a Facebook Live the other week, and I'm like, okay, people, yeah, we know all people matter, of course, but what's the deal here? If I'm a physician taking care of a patient, or if I'm a friend is hurting, is in need, feels, they've not been treated well, I'm not going to turn the conversation on myself and start talking about all the pain I've had or I perceive as more important, and just basically devalue and not validate their own pain. So to me, I'm thinking that's exactly what we have to do. We have to get outside of our egocentric selves in this country we live in, stop being spoiled brats, and think about other people and what their needs are and where we may have done them wrong, even if it's not our personal, and we didn't do the actual assault, or there could be microaggressions that we're not being aware of, and our biases and how it's influencing people around us without us even knowing, because we don't have the pain to sit there and worry about the things that other people have to worry about, such as, perhaps if you get pulled over in a car and you just, think you're gonna just get away with it, flip your hair because you're a cute little blonde, and, whatever it is. Anyway, I had to make a point because I think it's very relevant.
No, that is the point. And what I want to do is, you made the perfect example with Black Lives Matter. And what I want to do, there's two things I want to say, at least in this conversation. One, that the personal kind of interaction one-on-one, racism is not, it is, but I'm not really so worried about the Klan doing anything to me, right? That's not where this is, right? The personal is not the issue. And I think that many white people, when having discussion of race, think that they're being accused of being racist. That is most of the time not the case in any way, shape, form, or fashion. The discussion of race does not make people racist. Now, the discussion of race will make white people feel uncomfortable because you all do not have to think about race. Mm-hmm. And these conversations make you have to think about race and how, because of the way the country was created, that the normative values of the country was around initially white males, and then we expanded the body politic by adding on amendments, right? And so the understanding that the systemic portion of racism is really what all of this is about. It's not about the individual. It's not about the microaggressions, whatever. We can teach you how to be better down the future. Most people, white, black, indifferent, right? White, black, Asian, whatever, aren't trying to be racist interpersonally. That's not the issue. The issue is the systematic process through which people have to live and experience their lives, right? When it comes to housing, when it comes to medical care, when it comes to education, the gauntlet through which, and I like to use the term people of color, but that's not the space we're in now, because the black-white divide is what is the actual central axis of the United States. Everything else, every other person of color does better when black folks do better. So let's just work at the bottom, like Derek Bell talks about the faces at the bottom of the well. Let's start at the bottom, right? And if we fix that, everybody else who's of any kind of shade is going to do better, right? So I'm going to focus this primarily kind of on black, white, and then people will fall in somewhere between that standpoint. And so what we're talking about is the system in and of itself. So what you're seeing right now is a wholesale understanding of the history of policing in this country, right? Because it's really kind of got kicked off with George Floyd, right? If we look at the system of policing and how it was created, especially in the South, it was created to literally corral runaway slaves. So and I tell people all the time, there's nothing in this country that doesn't ultimately end back at slavery in some way, shape, form, or fashion. There's not a law, it all will eventually circle its way back to that ultimate foundation. And what this country has never done is done a Truth and Reconciliation Commission like South Africa did, right? There's been a bill in Congress just to study and understand what has happened, right? There's so much miseducation taught in our school systems that we really will not face up to the actual horror. Because once we figure out to the horror, we're not saying that people alive today are responsible for that, right? Like, you're not responsible for what your forefathers may have done or anything else. But as a society, we are, right? And as a society, as a governmental entity that we're all now a part of from a body politic, we are collectively responsible for the redress, atonement of that process. And the problem right now is because we've not done a full accounting of what actually happened and how the country was actually founded and what institutions actually benefited and still exist to this day, Aetna and all the other places, right? Like, wealth wasn't accumulated just by happenstance. The Ivy Leagues don't have billions of dollars in their foundations because of happenstance, right? All of that money gets traced back to brutality and the selling of people and human beings, right? We have to have that conversation about a country to have a real, like, oh crap, well, this is how we were created. This is how we became the economic power of the world. What does that mean on a go forward basis, right? And so what we want to have happen is people to depersonalize this. Black folks are not blaming white folks for being racist, unless you happen to be racist and have been racist to people, right? What we're really talking about is, let's look at the system through which we all are inculcated. So that when you see Black people in the elevator, and I might be a Black man in my scrubs, you might clutch your purse. Like, okay, well, all right, well, are there crime statistics that say that in this area, right? I mean, those kinds of things, that's the personal, right? And we can work on that individually. But the larger issue is the societal issue. That's what we really have to talk to. And if we talk about systems, right, let's just bring it back to medicine, right? Literally, and, I'm in a bunch of doctor groups that I'm in, and one of them is a group of dads, right? And so I go in there and just, during Juneteenth week, I just go in there and start dropping history stuff about medicine, right? And recent studies, right? We're not talking about Tuskegee or the HeLa cells or any of those things. We're talking about recent history where, white residents were, 73% of them showed some type of false belief around the biological basis and difference in Black versus white people when it came to pain, right? These are medical students and people who are already trained. 73% showed at least one thought process that Black folks feel pain in some way less than others, right? That's systemic, right? That Black women's mortality rate in birth is whatever it is from white and Hispanic women. That is systemic. That the world number one tennis star almost dies in post-childbirth, right? Those are the kinds of systemic things that we're really talking about here. And it just so happens to be focused on police right now, but bringing it back to us in medicine, when you see people wanting to rip down statues, when you see people wanting to do those kinds of things, there's a reason behind it, because we never did an accounting. Like, if you really go back into medical history and look at how many devices, how many procedures were learned on and performed on the enslaved, right? I mean, the gynecology is a field, right? I mean, it's just, it's littered, right? We should be taught all of that as medical students with an understanding of all of that, right? That creates empathy, that creates an understanding, and it tears down a false narrative of, well, people hate me for saying it, the false narrative of American exceptionalism. America is exceptional because we have a founding document that guarantees us all rights, and we wrote it down in paper. We're not exceptional because of the way we currently exist. We're exceptional because we can create a body politic that is independent of ethnicity, race, religion, that we all come together under a rule of law. But that rule of law has to be extended to all citizens, right? It can't just be on the books, but not necessarily fleshed out for everyone. And so what you see amongst Black folks is the understanding that for us, the United States is a failed state. It has rules on the books, that won't apply to us in many ways. We know it won't apply to us in many ways. We know we're not foolish enough to be gaslit anymore, right? We understand it. We're calling it out, and that's what you're seeing right now in the streets. Is people are calling out the historical gaslighting of the citizenry, like, oh no, everything is equal. We can all, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's a meritocracy. But we know it's not that, right? We have little studies that show in admissions to medical school that the biases that can occur there, and when people are made aware of it, all of a sudden the next year you get a more diverse medical class. Not because you do anything purposefully, you were just made aware of the inherent biases that we all have. Understand that Black folks are inherently biased against Black folks as well. This is not something that is just one-sided. It's just a society in which we live. And until we understand that, make it plain and make it real, that's how we're ultimately going to fix it. We start at the systemic level up top, and then we can talk about it on the individual level with people, right? But that's not where we really need to focus, in my opinion. We need to focus on the systemic issues first. And then as people become more aware of systemic issues, more empathy will come in, and then people will look at things very differently, right? And so that's just from my standpoint. I don't ever want to make these kinds of things personal. I don't want to make racism personal unless you are personally a racist. We all have our own inherent biases. What I want to talk about is the systemic nature of racism and how that falls down into unearned benefits for some and for hurdles for others. And nobody's blaming you for unearned benefits, right? We're not saying that, oh, you're at fault for getting it, but in understanding that, you got that, but it wasn't as easy for the rest of us to try to get that as either. And how do we fix that particular thing from a systemic standpoint? So sorry for the long rant.
No.
And that, but that implies in a lot of ways, and what I have been very appreciative through this process is the more that you are aware, right? This is the first step of any of this stuff is becoming aware and actually acknowledging this stuff occurred. And I think that's where we have some of this conflict is people think that they're aware, but they're not, right? Or they think that, I'm not a racist because I've never done this. And what was my favorite? I don't say Black Lives Matter. I say all lives matter. I'm like, really? Are you going to go, what does that even mean when you start saying these things like all lives matter? Is that being where you're starting from somebody else? Are you starting from a point of understanding or awareness of what that implies? And so that awareness piece then can also be very, very uncomfortable if your own belief systems and biases have, one, you are not recognized, that we're not even willing to recognize them, and two, we're not willing to be curious and challenge them at all. Because a point when you were talking there, Eric, what it really kind of resonated with me is I've seen all these discussions, and I try to stay out. I've realized in a lot of ways I'm not going to change anybody's mind about a lot of different things, but I always like to observe to see how people respond to some of the most innocuous. Like how could even somebody respond to this? Amazon reviews is an interesting piece when it comes to like pieces on the show. It's a little bit off topic, but I just watched like the Watchmen series that HBO did, which was phenomenal. But you finish it, and I don't want to do any spoilers or anything there, but there's a lot of threads of white supremacy and all this stuff in there. And I'm just wondering what people are going to say about this show. And then you go to the Amazon reviews, and it's like, this is racist against whites and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, where in the world did you identify yourself with this? What was your belief structure that was challenged by this show that made you assume that this was racist to whites? Because to me, that I only see that kind of reaction like that. And I guess this comes from pain, because we see this all the time in the pain world, is when your belief systems that are so tightly wound around your identity get touched just a little bit, we tend to react in an exaggerated fashion. So I guess I want to just kind of add that in is I think a lot of people, if you're getting reacted and you're having an extreme reaction to someone saying like Black Lives Matter, or you need to be aware of this, or maybe just let's have a little bit of talk about where this practice came from, what's the history behind it, and you're getting the strong visceral reaction to it, maybe you need to take a couple of minutes and just ask, why am I getting so upset about this? What is it that's touching in my own belief systems? What would I have to believe to be true that this is now making me think or making me not even want to hear what this person has to say? So it's so identity and ego formation, right? And
if you're, same thing we talk about with physicians, right? In terms of how do we decouple the identity and ego formation of who we are as physicians from what we do, right? White supremacy is identity and ego formation. There is a palpable benefit to being white in this country. And anything that challenges that, even, like I said, even equality feels like oppression if you've always been the center of the universe. And so if your ego identity is that I am at least better than, because we have a maldistributed kind of system in terms of wealth that cuts across racial lines, right? Class can be as big an impediment as race in many places, right? And then we can add in kind of misogyny, and there are lots of breakpoints in our country in terms of how people are treated. But if your ego identity is around the ability to say that you are better than someone else, and someone is challenging that and pulling that away and decentering you from, you know, the people would watch The Watchmen and say it's an issue because the heroes are not white. If your whole existence has been the heroes are almost always white, except for, you know, the Black Panther in these strange one-off movies. But if you become decentered and your ego has been around you being the center, that is destabilizing, especially if you have nothing else in your life that you can hold on to of meaning. And that's the real crux of this whole thing, honestly.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt again. You know, you just made me think of last night. I just watched Selma with my husband, and which was just painful. When you really are willing to open your eyes and see the pain that was caused, that you don't really have to live in some distant way or directly, like when you really allow yourself to feel it and you actually care and you're not downright evil inside, you will feel the pain. And I think that's where a lot of people don't want to go. But you just made me think about, my husband and I were wondering why people didn't win awards on this movie. It was phenomenal. At least I don't know of a lot of awards being given for some of these historical things that have occurred in our country, that it's almost like they don't want to award to Black actors. Sometimes I feel like it's the same thing. It's just like an admission of fault, or it's just shifting the focus. And it kills me at times when I see this, and that people are not put in the light that they should be because of people's discomfort with dealing with this issue. And it just reminded me.
No, I mean, think about it. Think about when Denzel Washington won his Oscar. Mm-hmm. Those of us in the Black community know he should have won the Oscar for Malcolm X. It is by far his best performance, mm-hmm. and the best performance of that year. He won it for playing a rogue cop who was a drug dealer. Think about Halle Berry when she won her Oscar. Mm-hmm. She won it for what? Essentially, well, let me not disparage her and be okay. She won it for essentially a sexual scene with Billy Bob Thornton, right? She was married to somebody who got killed on death row, and she was a poor woman, right? And so we see, as Black folks, we see this, right? Mm-hmm. Back to the systemic, right?
Right.
We see this, right? We see these things, right? These are conversations that don't happen between the white and Black community, right? Because most of us tend to be in our own social bubbles, relatively segregated social bubbles. And so we see all of these things, right? We understand America's history because it literally was born on our backs. Yeah. And so we see America in a very different light than white people see in this country. I mean, when Michelle Obama said, for the first time I was proud of my country, she got pilloried for it, most Black folks were like, yeah, we understand that, right? Yeah. We're like, yeah, we get that. We absolutely understand that, right? Yeah. And so in many ways, we live in two different nations, mm-hmm. of experiences and how we have to move through our days, right? Mm-hmm. You all don't necessarily know that about us because we have to be in your world to live, to work, to do those kinds of things. Right. But you don't have to be in our world. And so there are things, like I'm trying to pull back the curtain for your listeners in some ways around these things. Yeah. And for us, you know, Black folks for the most part don't hate white folks. Nobody's looking for revenge. Nobody's looking at that. All we're looking to do is be left alone and allowed to flourish under our own capacity as citizens, right? We don't want to sit around and talk about race all day. We would rather be like you all and not have to talk about race. Right. And just, hey, let's just go and do. But it so informs how we have to move through the world, how we have to gauge ourselves, how we have to present ourselves, how we have to be in spaces, how we have to say no or not say no, right?
Yeah.
All these things happen, especially in professional. And so taking it from the standpoint of being in medicine, right? You know, I don't know about your residency program, your medical school, where you currently work, but think about how many Black physicians there are there.
Well, I just pulled up a number. 2018, depending on how they self-identify, of course, 5% are considered African-American or Black. And then there's a multiracial 1%. And so obviously a minority.
Right? Yep. But think about your own practice.
Mm-hmm.
And think about your hospitals where you are. And everybody's listening. Think about that. Mm-hmm. Think about how isolating that is. Mm-hmm. And think about how many different people we have to come in contact with who have literally been in the United States and have been bathed in a lot of these misconceptions about who we are. So while you personally may not be an issue, doesn't mean the orderly down the hall, the nurse, the other physician that you don't like, doesn't react to us in a way that we know is biased, but you might not see. It's like, oh, that's nothing, right? Those microaggressions, right? So why it may not be you, you don't know what we experience through the rest of the day being in those spaces, right? And I tell people all the time, really have a conversation. If you've never had a racial conversation with a person you consider to be a friend who's Black, they're not your friend. They've not let you in. They will, because we do not let people into that space very easily, because we know how offended white people can get because they think we're attacking. We're like, no, we're not attacking you. This is just our lived experience. And it's not all white people. That's what I'm saying. We've got to depersonalize this stuff. Most people in this country are not racist or not biased and aren't trying to be purposefully. They might do it by accident, but not purposefully. And that's why we have to take it out of the personal and go to systemic. What does that look like? Like I put out a meme, I literally put a meme in the group that we're in on a newspaper page. It was a Black guy who was stolen a car, and his picture was 3 times the size of a white guy who killed a sheriff's deputy. Mm-hmm. Same page, same newspaper, literally 3 days ago, right? Mm-hmm. It's just, it's those kind of subconscious things that we see. We're like, oh, white people may not think anything of it. Oh, okay, well, but we see it. We're like, wait a second, this guy killed a sheriff. Why is he not front page news? Why is the Black guy who stole a car, why is his picture there like that, right? That's what we mean by systemic, right? Yeah. That's what we're talking about. We want to when we're talking to white people, we want to depersonalize it from them as an individual and say, well, what does that look like at your job? What are the hiring managers at your job doing, right? What does that look like at the DA's office in terms of who gets charged and who doesn't get charged? Who did you vote for, right? How is their record when it comes to treating all citizens equally when they do the same amount of crime, right? Those are the thought processes we want to move this to for people who want to help. It's not the individual so much. It's the how do we dismantle the system, which will then tumble its way down to the individual, because the individual in many ways is unconscious. We've unconsciously taken in some of these biases. Well, if we change the system, those unconscious biases may not roll down quite as hard.
Yeah. I just want to make a comment that I think that there is a level of grace that so many people have had pain, especially when you're dealing with those who are Black that have been done wrong. And it's almost like they're bearing the brunt of that, and the way that I find, and this is just collective thought. I mean, obviously each individual is different, but I feel like there's more grace in dealing with the absurdities that those who are racist or are unaware of their biases or make these little microaggressions. And it's something that I'm always appreciative of, but at the same time, I realize that there's such a bigger sense of responsibility, kind of like what you're saying. There's a need for systemic change, and as much as you don't want to talk about it and you just want to go on with your life and not have to have these conversations that are uncomfortable all the time, I feel like there's such a deep desire, not just from those who are Black, but those who are white and don't want to see these atrocities happen. I just think that there's it's just a powerful momentum right now, because it's I think out in front of our eyes way more than it used to be. And we can't, for those that are recognizing that, we can't deny this. It is so real. And I'm sorry if people are out there that are white that are in pain, like dealing with this, but you know, this is a hidden pain that's so many that we have not been, for those that are not paying attention, or opening their eyes. There's so many people that just need to be okay with getting uncomfortable with this conversation, and it's okay to be uncomfortable. And I think it's good to ask questions. You can have a caveat at the beginning, like, okay, if you don't want to talk about that, that's cool, but I really want to understand you better. I want to understand the struggles, and whenever it's a good time, or if okay for now, I mean, I'd love to hear what you have to say, but I do have another question, but Kevin, if you want to chime in before my question.
I want to say, before we go to Kevin, one thing I want to say.
Ahead.
So Black folks show the grace that you're talking about because we would die if we didn't.
Right.
One, we already do die. So there's two issues, right?
Survival.
You cannot have Black rage because we will be killed.
Right.
So that's number one. So we have learned to subsume our rage, and that's why we die earlier than everybody else. If you take Black folks similarly situated in countries in Africa and countries that are Black run, our life expectancy goes up by 10 points. Doesn't matter if we have diabetes, same age match cohort. Racism absolutely shortens our lifespan here in this country. And in Brazil and any country that had that kind of Jim Crow oppression on it, it's an absolute epidemiological fact, right? Yeah. And so that grace is an existential reaction, but it does ultimately kill us over time. So
which is horrible. In general, the invisible again is creeping up, the intangibles, the things that we don't always quantify as being important for our overall wellness. That in and of itself, just holding that in, which comes across as grace, but I think this overall movement is part of the beginning of healing that I hope one day will make a huge difference on the longevity of any man or woman of color. And thank you for that clarification too.
We'll see. I mean, it runs in cycles, right? We had this in '92 with Rodney King, right? Yeah. I mean, as Dr. King says, and I'll paraphrase, I don't know exactly, the arc of justice bends. The arc of history bends to justice eventually. We just may not see that arc sometimes necessarily in our lifetime. So we'll see. I mean, this may be a turning point. This may be a zeitgeist change. My mother thinks it is. You have to remember, my mother drank from segregated water fountains. Yeah. This isn't history, right? This is literally, she was chased in Savannah, Georgia by a lynch mob, right? This is not history. This is there are people still living who lived under Jim Crow, right? And this is not some 300, 400 years ago. These threads and strands work their way all the way through to today and keep moving forward. So
yeah, I think your mom, I mean, I'm an optimist by nature, but this is globally felt. This pain is globally felt. I mean, even rugby players are kneeling, and not just because of the flag issue and all that, but just in general for the way things are going right now with George Floyd and the whole Black Lives Matter movement. But
remember, the kneeling was never about the flag. What Colin Kaepernick was kneeling about was George Floyd. Yeah. He just saw George Floyd because there are literally, if you think about it, I think I read the statistic, 1 to 2 Black folks a week are killed by police. And so you didn't have to pick George Floyd. You could pick anybody, right? He knew what was happening and was like, I'm going to use this platform to let the world know from a systemic standpoint, this is happening. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Kevin?
Yeah, well, I've got to know all my points that I wanted to say here.
Exhausting, isn't it?
Well, it is.
But it's the important stuff that exhausts you, you know. But it's good. Good
I'll tell you what derailed me was when you were talking about your mom, because then here's me wanting to have interesting conversations. Like, oh my God, I would love to talk to your mom now because she's lived through these different phases.
Right? Interesting enough, she will not talk about it.
Really?
After she will not ever talk about that.
And the reason is because from my standpoint, as I've sort of grown as an individual, I'm really into this awareness. Like the more you are aware, and the more awareness comes before understanding, and being able to find people that can provide you the historical perspective as well as an evolving viewpoint to see how things are different over time. Because you mentioned Rodney King, and it was a different time in my life. I was obviously a different age. and the environment seemed to be different. And I don't remember, this is hindsight obviously, but I can't remember the discussions being the same then as they are now, where there was talking about riots, they were talking about wrong, who was wrong in this or whatever. But this time, again, I'm just might be older, it just seems to be, there seems to be more of an awareness of how systemic this problem is, that it kind of inoculates everything, is kind of set in the fabric of our country for sure. And I think that's the biggest piece for me as a white guy, is how can we be more aware of our implicit and our explicit biases, just to be aware that those biases exist. And I think I've said this before, is like the thing that gets me really mad is when there's a reactionary component to this discussion. Well, I shouldn't even say that. It's not a discussion if you're having a reactionary kind of, I'm not going to listen to you at all. But people are just not even willing to admit that they have any sort of biases. And I grew up in a small town, and it was predominantly white. And you just think, well, I don't see it. Well, of course you don't see this, is because you live in a community where there's 3 Black people in it. And so the first time I ever saw, I was in a fraternity, and someone called me out on some of the language I was using, and I felt really hurt at the time, but I mean, that changed me because it was somebody I would totally respect. And then when I moved to Chicago, which had a completely different demographic mix that I had never seen before, and that was the first place that I saw that explicit bias that I had, the implicit we sort of is more difficult to kind of tease out, because that's the microaggressions, and that's the little comments here and there, and that's the way people's body language is. But it was shocking to me is just the explicit bias that you could see in some areas of the country, that really, again, was shocking to me, and just increased my level of awareness, so that I was actually even, again, just being willing to admit that there's a lot here more that I don't understand. As a white person, I don't have the lived experience. I don't have the experience that, it doesn't matter where I was, where I lived, or whatever. I just don't have that perspective because I'm not the one who's living in it. I'm always going to be the outside observer. And so, I just kind of want to call that out, because there was another thing that you were talking about, Melissa. I can't remember the exact thing is I do think it's important, if you are not the one with lived experiences in this, it is important to step back and try to understand first before we start opening our mouths in such a way with solutions. And I've, we got to step back a little bit, but I really think there's a good chance here for people to learn and understand. And for a lot of us to do a lot of that awareness, learning, and understanding, we just got to shut our mouths and be willing to talk and just say, hey, can you tell me what your experiences are? And then stop. So I'm going to stop now.
And that's perfect. And that's exactly where we are. We're at a point where we just need folks to listen to us and stop telling us what is wrong with us inherently, right? What is wrong with us as we have a deficiency in who we are. Just listen, right? The next step, honestly, is you have to, and I tell people all the time, racism is a white people problem. Black folks will not fix racism. There's nothing we can do. We can plead to our faces are blue until we're dying in the streets as we currently are. White people are going to fix racism. We are not going to fix it. There's nothing that we're going to do that is going to make people treat us better. And that's just a hard reality, right? And so the next step is those closed rooms where people are saying things, you have to check them. You have to stop. You have to be uncomfortable enough to tell your potential family members, people that you know, bosses, subordinates, that is not how we are going to conduct ourselves here, right? Especially because, racism and economics are intertwined, right? I make the joke all the time, unless, you're getting lynched by the Klan somewhere, Black folks only feel racism when we need something from white people. And most of that is economic, right? And so the big thing that we need, especially as it relates to hiring and firing, is to make sure that there are fair shakes in the places where we, from an economic standpoint, we can move forward, right? And so from a hiring standpoint, are people being treated fairly in your job, right? If you see something, will you say something, right? The old terrorism. If you see something, say something. That's what we need. I don't want to say progressive. White folks who care, we need you to say something to white folks who do not. Because there are rooms that we will never be in, where things are getting discussed that we will never know about. And if you're going to be an ally requires that you give something, that you sacrifice something yourself. And some of that may just be social standing, right? You may be ostracized from your friend or familial group because you've taken a stand to say that, you know what, prejudice is not something that I'm going to stand for in my presence. So on the personal level, that's what we really need if you want to be an ally. Marching is great. Giving money is great too. But allyship is you sacrificing something of yourself to change things. Sacrificing something of your ego and your standing, wherever that standing may be, to change things.
Yeah. Speaking of just this 5% of physicians are, Black or, as I said, quote, African-American. I remember a situation, I was actually reading an article about a situation on an airplane, and the flight attendant said they had a medical emergency and asked for a physician, and it was a female Black physician, and she was basically wanted her to prove herself that she had her card, or like we ever carry our medical license. I mean, it might be a good idea, but still, she refused to let her help someone who was really in critical situation. And then I guess eventually a white radiologist raised his hand, he's a physician, ended up talking and validated the physician for the flight attendant, who was literally being extremely rude. There was some pictures of it. It was just like horrible. I'm just wondering, obviously it's equating that Black Americans can be educated or can have professions that have not been dominated by other than white Americans for the most part. In fact, it says 56.2% of physicians are white Caucasian. Have you had situations that people have negated your capabilities, your intellect, whether they felt threatened or it was an indoctrinated value or belief that you're not capable of such? I just feel like pulling a few examples of maybe what you've experienced for others to understand.
So it's interesting. My wife says I carry myself in such a way that people tend to respect me, which I think is actually true. I don't have some of the, like, I was never mistaken for a janitor as a med student or any of those kind of stories, right? And I don't know. It is, as they say, it's a fine line between arrogance and confidence, right? But I mean, listen, my first interaction with the police, I was 9 years old riding my bike in the town next to ours. And I grew up in a suburb of New York City, right? Westchester County, one of the wealthiest counties in the country. I was riding my bike in Pelham, 9 years old, going to get baseball cards, my buddies and I. Cops roll up on us and ask us what we're doing. Like, it's a public street. I'm riding a bike, right? I mean, that, right? It's those kinds of things that, and for the most part, I get out, like, I don't get, knock on wood, I don't get racially profiled driving for the most part. And when I do, I just tell them I'm a doctor and they usually let me go. There's a certain amount of privilege that I have that I will absolutely exercise to move forward. But I mean, I was in residency. We own a house on an island that really has no Black folks and historically has been known to racially profile Black people who come there. And so I pulled into my driveway. I was listening to something on the radio and a cop pulls behind me, right? And I was maybe 6 months into residency, right? So I'm 22 years old. And so I'm pulled into my driveway, but didn't move all the way in and didn't open my garage door. So the cop pulls next to me. I know exactly what he's doing. He's trying to kind of figure some stuff out. And so I just sat there and I'm going to make him, now granted, this is a small town, right? I do not recommend any other people do this regularly, but this is a small town island, there's 2 or 3 cops at any particular point in time. And so I just sit there, I'm like, I'm going to make him get out of his car because I know what he's doing, right? And I'm going to make him get up and walk up to me and ask me something. And so I just sat there, while I care in the world, just sat there. Eventually he flashed his light at me. I didn't move. I didn't do anything. Kept my hands where everybody could see it, whatever. Got out of the car. He came to my side and I hit my garage door opener. My garage opened up. And I rolled my window down. I was like, "Yes, officer, how can I help you?" And he just started fumbling. And I'm like, "Well," and I'm like, "Listen, I live here. Please understand, my wife and I now live here. We are here." He's like, "No, we're not." I'm like, "Don't worry about it. I'm here. Thanks for making sure I got home okay." Right? It's little things like that. And honestly, I mean, we still have a house on that island now, right? And so I can always tell when there's a new cop who has been hired because I'm going to get pulled over. And then they just walk up and say, "Hey, you're new, aren't you?" He's like, what do you mean? How did you know? I'm like, "Because I live here." And so, whenever the new cop comes up, I go up to the police station and say, hey, who are the new cops? Hey, I live here, just so you know. And then we never have an issue, right? But that's something a white person would never have to think about doing. Yeah. You would never go to the police station to tell people that you live there, right? That's what we mean by privilege, right? Yeah. Those kinds of things. How do you navigate through the world without having to think about who you are, right? We can't do that, right? And there are things that we have privilege in as well, right? As a man, I have a certain amount of privilege. We all have privilege in different areas. Having privilege isn't bad. Pretending like you don't have it and gaslighting people is.
Yeah. One other question kind of related to that, and, being that, and I kind of know the answer for me, being married to someone who's a man of color, and I think about things that my friends don't think about, who are traditional Caucasian married couple. But do you find that your choices of where you travel in the United States is impacted by the fact that you're a Black man?
So
like countrysiding.
Yes. When I travel, where I travel, absolutely, right? But even deeper than that, right? So let's take it back to med school, guys. Mm-hmm. Those of you who are listening, you all were thinking about doing residency programs all over the country and kind of where you would be and where you wouldn't be. There are just certain places that your Black medical school friends were not going to, programs that they were not going to apply to because they were in places that we just weren't going to go and live in, right? Mm-hmm. Those are the kind of things that from a career choice standpoint, now, there could be a program that's perfectly great for you, right? But it's not going to be socially what it needs to be, right? And so these have real career implications in our ability to do some of these things, right? And so for us, I always make the joke, I don't drive through slave states at night, right? I live in Houston, Texas, right? Vidor, Texas is an hour down the road, right? Everybody who knows Texas knows what Vidor is, right? Now, interestingly enough, they had a Black Lives Matter rally the other day, so things do change over time, right? But we all know that's a sundown town, meaning it's a town that Black people cannot be found in after sundown or something bad may happen to you. Those towns still exist in this country. And it is not relegated. I'm not a basher of the South. This stuff is not relegated to the South, right? And so, yes, we will modify how and where we travel based upon the history of certain places, right? But, we have to modify how we exist just in our everyday life anywhere, right? I don't wear hoodies. I couldn't play with guns growing up, right? There's just certain things that I could not do as a young Black boy because my mother's like, yeah, that's not going to happen, right? It's just not, John Crawford got killed in a Walmart holding a gun in a Walmart that sells guns, right? There's just certain things that we cannot do. Hoodies, right? Hoodies into stores, right? There are ways of being that we have to think about that other people don't have to think about. And that is the bias that comes in that what we call kind of constrains our lives and constrains who we are and who we can be as individuals. Because ultimately, and this is a much larger conversation for a different time that I have with my family, being considered Black is a identity against oppression. It's not an identity that I self-identified, right? I don't necessarily want someone outside of me to identify who I am as an individual, right? Back to that libertarian thing, right? I don't want who I am and what I put on to be just for protection, right? I want to be who I am as an individual by the things that I can do and provide for other people. And so I don't like to be defined by others personally. But again, that's a much larger conversation for a different time.
Sure. Came back to the category, categorization of people and whatnot.
Which if you're self-categorizing, that's fine. But when you're being categorized by others, that is very confining psychologically.
Right.
Absolutely.
Especially when it's associated with a belief that is not beneficial for society.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Kevin?
No, it was a lot to think about because again, this lack of awareness and when you're talking about there's areas of the country that you wouldn't want to go as a resident. And so then I'm thinking, okay, that definitely has impact on your career path because then you're thinking about highly competitive specialties. Now you're dropping the number of locations that you would potentially match into because you're looking at something that has absolutely nothing to do with the quality of the program anymore. That's an inequality that that I would never have had to face, and it's just so, it's been a privilege just to listen, because even when you think you have some level of awareness, there's always something else coming up that you didn't think of before that really just makes and we just need more understanding. We need more awareness. And I really like how you called out that if you want to make a difference, then you got to start in those rooms where a Black person may not be. It is up to those who are in that room then to demonstrate by action and behavior that they're going to change these things. And I think I hope everybody that's coming from this, no matter what your background is we all need to be more courageous in whatever environment we are in to make those difficult decisions. Because the easy ones, if you're in the right group who are all saying the right things and they seem to be very supportive, that's easy. Anybody can do that. It's when we're in those locations that aren't, where you may be the lone voice, that then we have to actually demonstrate and actually make a difference. So
that's where the courage is, right? That's where the actual courage of convictions actually lies. So when we're talking about Dr. King and courage of convictions and those types and moral character, those are the times where moral character shows up or it doesn't.
Yeah. I really truly believe, this is a phenomenal, episode. And I think that the moral fiber of those who are white are the ones that truly, and I do believe that, are part of making this change for those who are Black, and that those who are of color, I think the most important thing, in my opinion, is just this idea of just helping us understand when we misunderstand something, and we should be able to eventually figure it out, but at the same time, we don't have your experience. And I think, if anything, I appreciate someone like you who's willing to help us understand what it's like and maybe see the answers or the things we need to do in a different light. And I just want to thank you for helping us kind of see it from a different angle, because we don't necessarily live what you've lived. And I just appreciate your time and generosity and willingness to have a courageous conversation about this. It's not always comfortable for everybody.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What I try to do, at least in this, is pull back the curtain of what Black folks talk about in our own circles that white people don't tend to hear, and give you a little bit of understanding of what it's like to walk in our shoes in terms of the things we have to think about. And again, women have to do the same thing, right? We have to have these conversations for women as well, right? We all live in areas where we're trying to just make it, where we're all citizens that are treated equally. That's all we're trying to do. And the problem though is it will require dismantling of things that currently exist that work for some people. Those things have to go away for it to work for more people. And that is scary for people. And so, it's going to be a fight.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate thing, but it's interesting because we talked briefly. I can't remember if it was an episode or not, when we were talking about abundance and scarcity mindsets. This win-lose phenomenon, and really, if we are treating people in such a way that we are not taking away potential opportunities from them, that in no way really impacts the opportunities that you may have as an individual. Meaning, if we're going to go from this idea that there's somehow only a select number of opportunities, and only because of that, anything that goes to another group of people somehow takes away from my potential opportunity, I can see that, that's really scary, but that's actually not necessarily how the world exactly works when we're thinking from an idea of seeing abundance, and particularly with accelerating technologies and the potentials that we have. There's doom and gloom everywhere in the world, but there is so much opportunity too. And if we kind of go from that viewpoint of having other people have opportunities which they can grow and develop, actually will impact my life in a positive manner as well, rather than make my life worse. So
yep.
A lot to think about.
Yeah. So interestingly on that, McKinsey did a study and it showed that if Black folks in this country were brought up to parity with white people in terms of income level, right? Just income level, right? Forget wealth, which is a different discussion. Income level, you would end up with another $1.35 trillion of GDP growth in this country.
We could all benefit from.
We could all benefit from a little extra, another trillion or so,
Exactly, of productive capacity. And that's the problem, is we are losing, we've lost generations and generations of people who could have been productive citizens and created productive families because of their prison industrial complex and just poverty, right? And so we're losing human potential just from a competitive standpoint as a nation, in the way that we currently operate.
Yeah, I'd like to finish off with, actually I was going to pull my statue over there. It really is expressing this idea that we need to lift all of each other up and help us. You talked earlier, Dr. Tait, about feeling like people at the bottom, and we just really need to all help elevate each other and get us to a place where we're really bringing the best out of each other. And there's one quote I wanted to end with that I saw on Twitter that I thought would be a great thing to remind us of. And if the truth makes you angry, you got to evaluate the lie that makes you comfortable.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I'd quote who it is, but it looks like a physical therapist that actually said that. I thought that was really a reminder that maybe that overreaction that Kevin's talking about there's really a truth underlying, or the lie that's underlying that, that's really revealing about the situation. So thank you again, Dr. Tait, for joining us on the Change Physician podcast. We look forward to seeing you all on the next episode.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you for having this conversation.
Welcome.